On Monday, November 28, Ohio State University had an active male shooter on campus, according to a tweet posted by school officials. This stirred a question of why was there an active shooter on campus? The shooter must have had the mindset to know that murder is wrong, if he was taught it. He should have at least feared the consequences of his crime. Would that have stopped him? If not, who would? This led to another question of whether or not there was security around campus at the time. If there was, would the shooter have been less likely to assault others and reflect his moral beliefs? This leads us to our question on whether or not fear plays a role in teaching and applying ethics. The first questions we had to answer were, what is fear? And what are ethics? Fear is a very powerful emotion and allows us to perceive things negatively. It affects our sense of perception. It's the only emotion known for holding one back. It can easily be used to manipulate others because such a strong negative emotion stirs obedience. People are often under their control, not in control. For example, what humans acknowledge. If you're afraid of chows, you support the status quo. If you're afraid of crime, you hire more police officers and build more prisons. What are some types of fear? There are 5 basic forms of fear we all share as human beings. First, there is fear of rejection, which stems from the natural human fear that people may not like us. Secondly, there's a fear of being trapped. Whether it's being trapped physically or emotionally, people often tend to fear if they will ever find a way out or stay captive forever. There's also the fear of death, which causes denial to emerge from people or a sense that their life is meaningless. In addition, there's a fear of God. Fear of his judgment leads Christians to steer from a sinful life or action, or stop sinning in general. And lastly, fear of ego death. The fear of the shattering or disintegration of one's constructed sense of lovability, capability, and worthiness. What ways of knowledge concern fear? 2 of them are emotion and reason. Fear is indeed a strong negative emotion that can abuse the use of important rationales such as reason. For example, seeing a spider may urge a sudden rush of fear to overwhelm you, causing you to scream, overlooking the fact that spiders are practically harmless. All in all, there's no logical reason to be so afraid of a spider as reason encounters. However, fear says otherwise. A limitation of emotion as a walk is that fear is only one amongst many others, so the feeling that fear brings cannot generalize the entirety of the walk. In addition, emotion cannot be measured, so it would be difficult to understand how much fear is needed to influence ethical behavior. A limitation of reason, as we already mentioned, is that fear can stifle reasoning. There is also sense perception and memory. Past experiences that proved as traumatizing or fear-inducing can change the way we perceive things. For example, getting a shark bite might repel a victim from interacting with large bodies of water, especially ones containing sharks. They also could have a different perception of oceans caused by fear. A limitation of sense perception as a walk is that fear usually only is triggered by sight or sound, so the other 3 perceptions act as a void in that sense. A limitation of memory is that humans almost can never fully recall a past experience, which could lead to faulty assumptions involving the presence or act of fear. We come back to our second question of what is ethics. Ethics are a general sense of what is right and wrong. It's molded by our intuition, which stems from our memories or upbringing. We are born and disciplined with a gut feeling that warns us of what is acceptable and what will have major consequences. Ethics are influenced by our upbringing, religious beliefs, life experiences, social interactions, codes of ethics introduced by organizations and workplaces, and studying ethical dilemmas. Fear is a general idea, for the most part. However, ethics, not so much. A sociologist asked many people what ethics meant to them. A few responses included, being ethical is doing what the law requires. Ethics has to do with my religious beliefs. Ethics consists of the standards of behavior our society accepts. Ethics has to do with what my feelings tells me is right or wrong. Or the most shocking of them all, I don't know what that word means. This was conducted by Raymond Baumhart. From a business perspective, ethics is indeed a vague and hair-pulling issue. Some believe that it is really personal. Everyone has their own view of right and wrong, so it's impossible to get a conscience. Others see ethics as black and white thinking, also known as binary thinking or false dilemma. and they don't want their opinions challenged. There are many different views on the role of fear in ethics. For example, in earth science, a community doesn't need fear. All ecological principles don't function correctly out of fear. Fear promotes unethical behavior. We found this argument flawed because comparing ecological principles to human beings is more of a false analogy. Nonetheless, fear, in this case, is seen as ineffective in encouraging ethics. From a government perspective, we found an expert from a research report. It states, the government is more dependent on fear of punishment to motivate good behavior. But while government is not equipped to cultivate some virtues in citizens, it does have a role to play in their moral formation. It articulates a sense of justice, impartial judgment, and equality before the law. In this case, fear is seen as a motivator of ethics. From a social work perspective, we found an excerpt from the NASW. The principles of this code are expressed in broad statements to guide ethical decision-making. These statements provide a framework. They cannot and do not dictate conduct to cover particular situations. Social workers are expected to follow the code of conduct when displaying ethical behavior, without the involvement of fear. In a business perspective, the vast majority of managers mean to run ethical organizations, yet corporate corruption is widespread. Part of the problem, of course, is that some leaders are out-and-out crooks, and they direct the maleficence from the top, but that is rare. Much more often, we believe, employees bend or break ethics rules because those in charge are blind to unethical behavior and may even unknowingly encourage it. In this excerpt, it can be implied that without fear, unethical behavior is exacerbated. Fear is a structural support. This excerpt from a business article led us to ponder over the thought that if bosses, who are usually a symbol of fear and intimidation, are blind to their employees, then lack of fear from the part of workers could possibly encourage lack of ethics. Whereas a boss who is set in his ways and very attentive would exuberate fear and prevent more room for unethical behavior. We thought it was interesting that the authors used the word blind. The definition of blindness is lacking perception, awareness, or discernment. Does lack of perception from the side of a leader encourage unethical behavior from the side of an employee? When we are fearful, are our senses stimulated, which makes it hard to be unaware and unethical? Essentially, this perspective implies that fear acts as a stimulator of senses. Since science focuses on concrete facts, it would be more difficult for a scientist to have a say about the role of fear that goes against the biological principles he or she sees on a daily basis. Whereas the government maintains a society where fear is used on a daily basis to prevent crimes, so the role of fear takes on a new meaning. It's also a responsibility of the government to address emotionally charged issues and not only concrete information. In addition, managers that run businesses also may have a similar outlook on fear to that of the government, seeing as managers are also overseeing a group of people, and in order to maintain order, fear may have to be enforced. Lastly, social workers are given a set of rules to follow, also known as the Code of Ethics, which enforces ethics without the involvement of fear. This is crucial in order for them to effectively communicate with others and maintain social capital. In this particular case, the role of fear changes. It has little influence on one's ethics if one were already trained to embody them. To tie in our presentation, we'd like to include some scenarios that give insight to the minds of certain individuals. Scenario number 1. Consider the case of Chester. Chester has a very strong desire to molest young children. If he thought he could get away with it, he would abduct and molest the children playing on a playground near his house. But Chester is very afraid of getting caught by the police, since there is a police station across the street from the playground. As a result of his fear, Chester never does in fact molest any children, and thus isn't deserving of blame or punishment for his behavior in this regard. For Chester, fear of being caught suppressed his bad ethics from becoming a reality. A limitation that one could point out is that generally, some pedophiliacs lack the guilt and moral responsibility that normal people should feel. Thus, their thoughts or acts should not be seen as a moral failing. Our second scenario is one pertaining to basketball players. When college basketball Atlantic Coast Conference increased the number of referees per game from 2 to 3 in 1978, the number of fouls dropped by 34%. Why? Basketball players fouled less often because they were more likely to get caught. In fact, the actual decline in fouling was probably even larger, since fouls that may have gone unnoticed by 2 referees were more likely to be caught when there were 3 officials. Fear of being caught led to more honest behavior, just as the players were less likely to play unfairly. Fear, in this scenario, can be applied to make the idea of having ethics or behaving honorably more approachable. Fear is a broad concept that can almost be narrowed down when explored efficiently. From our research, we learned that there are essentially 5 types of fear: fear of death, fear of rejection, fear of being trapped, fear of ego death, and fear of God. These 5 basic forms of fear can be seen in many scenarios to have different influences on our perception of what is wrong or right, also known as ethics, which is other-dependent. Fear of rejection is most seen to have an influence on individuals that seem to value being a part of society. They described ethics as what society deemed acceptable. Fear of being trapped or imprisoned seemed to influence those who displayed very immoral behaviors or thoughts, like Chester the pedophiliac. Bad ethics were suppressed at the thought of having to pay legal consequences. Fear of ego death, also known as humiliation or shame, seemed to influence figures who performed in front of many people, such as basketball players. To avoid humiliation or being called out on fouls, basketball players played more honorably. Fear of death can be related to fear of being trapped or imprisoned. It can also be reflected in suicidal attempts that are never carried out. The fear of death can refrain one from making a troubling decision that is not viewed as ethical. Lastly, fear of God or gods generally influences those committed to a religion. In order to remain in good standing with their faith, they keep to the moralistic laws written in their religious references. BAM! Just trying to see if you're awake. Anyway, overall, fear is a very powerful emotion and has the ability, some may call it manipulative, to influence what we perceive as right or wrong. The shooting at Ohio State University was not ethical, and it can be assumed that the shooter lacked fear, or to a certain degree that would allow him to reflect over his actions and the moral and physical consequences.